Welcome to On the Go with AAUW, the American Association of University Women. I'm Kathleen Myers. This episode is about presidential elections throughout history. There have been some fascinating, very interesting campaigns throughout our American history. And our topic will start with the book For Fear of an Elective King, written by Kathleen Bartoloni Toison. This is the story of George Washington and the controversy about the first presidential title. Welcome, Kata.
Thank you so much, Kathleen.
So what can you tell us about George Washington and the controversy about his title?
Well, the story that I tell in For Fear of an Elective King is a story about Washington's early presidency and the first Washington administration. At that time, what we're seeing is the country's struggle with and very cautious acceptance of presidential power. The presidency was quite controversial in the beginning. In the early spring of 1789, at the beginning of the new constitutional era, a controversy erupted in Congress between the House and the Senate over how to address the president, as whether he should be addressed with a high grand title like Highness or Majesty, which is what the Senate preferred, or the House was unanimously opposed to that and only wanted this very simple President of the United States. Nothing, no grand title, no Highness, no Majesty, which is what a lot of people were talking about. Congress, the press, and individuals throughout the country debated over 30 titles, 30. Some with royal overtones. In fact, most with royal overtones. Serene Highness, Sublime Highness, Illustrious Majesty. In fact, you know, in a world full of monarchs, which is what we were dealing with at that time, the outcome of President of the United States was not a guaranteed thing for the title controversy.
Well, that's interesting. So the presidency has always been at the heart of a controversy since our very first one.
Just what kind of a president did our country want and need? The Constitution set no term limits for the president, and as a result, people worried about whether the president would be too strong of a king, or a weak, corruptible king, and whether he would be a strong or weak president. Everyone worried, without term limits, that he would stay in the presidency too long and become king-like. In the title debate, the Senate in particular, the senators were mostly the very powerful elites from the various states. They found themselves in a very difficult situation on the issue of a presidential title. The senators risked being labeled as monarchists if they favored a high title like Highness or Majesty. But if they didn't give the president a strong title, they risked being damned as aristocrats and the powerful few who wanted to corrupt the president.
Oh my.
So one way or the other, they felt that they were in a tight situation. What they tried to do, they tried to walk a fine line. The Senate went on record to recommend the title of, and this is really what they recommended, His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of their liberties.
Oh my goodness.
Which the senators saw as a title that was in keeping with global title conventions. But although they recommended this title, in their final resolution, they totally capitulated to the House's wish for no title. And they went on record that they would address the president simply as President of the United States with no introductory title like Highness or Majesty.
Well, my goodness, it sounds to me, Kata, like this strength or weakness of the power of the office. This has been a theme that recurs over time.
Actually, that's very true, Kath. When The early Congress debated various presidential powers like the veto, treaty making, power of appointments, the relative strength or weakness of the president, and the way that that person would wield the power was a constant issue. And it was an issue in Congress when they were debating how much power to give the president, and then these same issues spilled over into presidential campaigns.
And speaking of presidential campaigns, have you ever known a presidential campaign that is so uncivil than what we've seen in our very recent history?
It's been uncivil. I will grant you that. However, it's kind of alarming, but also maybe just a little bit reassuring to know that it's been uncivil for years. I would say, especially since the election of 1800, that there have been many contentious, ugly fights over the presidency.
Yeah, the one of 1800 was quite ugly. And that was when Thomas Jefferson was up against John Adams. And that was the first time that a vice president ever ran against a president.
Yes.
And there were other contenders in the race as well, including Aaron Burr.
Right, right. And the election of 1800, can you imagine how tense it must have been in the White House to have both, although Jefferson wasn't there a lot, but to have the president and the vice president running against each other?
Running against each other.
Consider
so strange.
the political landscape of 1800. As the election neared, the country was still in mourning over the death of their savior, George Washington, who just died in December of 1799. Plus, Philadelphia, which was still the seat of government at that time, was even more depressed because the seat of government was moving to its permanent location in Washington, D.C., the new capital city. It was the closing of an era. And now the election would be different from any election that's ever happened even since then, when it pitted the vice president against the president. It was also an unusual election because it was run under the Sedition Act. And in that case, it meant that any person could go to jail if he criticized the president.
Oh my goodness, we'd all
Yeah.
be in jail.
So although everyone shunned the party label still at that time, the ins were the Federalists and the outs were the Democratic Republicans. And almost everybody was partisan in one way or the other.
Well, in modern times, it's very partisan. And that's where we get all this, name calling and mudslinging and, the factions that are really
Yes,
up
it was an unsavory time even then. And I have a couple of quotes.
Okay.
When Jefferson was running, now often it's not Jefferson but his surrogates that are saying some of these things. But one of his surrogates called Adams, and I quote here, a hideous, hermaphroditical character who had neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Adams's supporters, again, it's not Adams, but it's his surrogates, are answered by asking voters, are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames? Your female chastity threatened? Children writhing on the pike? Great God of compassion and justice, shield my country from destruction.
Oh my, they were using fear tactics even back then.
Even back then. The election ended up as a tie between Jefferson and his vice presidential pick, Aaron Burr. John Adams ran a distant third. So both Burr and Jefferson got 73 votes each in the Electoral College. So the tie-breaking vote at that point went to the House of Representatives, not all of whom were on board with the Jefferson presidency, Burr vice presidency concept. Over 7 days of voting, and after 35 ballots, with most of the Federalists supporting Burr each time and always ending up in a tie, a compromise was reached. In the compromise on the 36th ballot, Federalists turned in blank ballots.
Oh.
And they thus avoided voting for the hated Jefferson.
Oh, dear.
And even though the blank ballots finally allowed Jefferson to win.
Wow. And that was the very contentious presidential election that spurred Congress to pass the
That's right.
12th Amendment, saying that no longer was the runner-up, you know, the one who came in with the second most votes, no longer was that person going to automatically become the vice president.
That's right.
So it was because of that election.
In the early years of the American Republic, the various political groups avoided being called parties and shunned the idea of factions. But factions and political divisions over the nature of the national government only became more intense after the election of 1800, and especially after that difficult 7 days trying to choose a president.
Oh, my.
By 1828, party politics were in full bloom. And it's the age of Jackson at that point.
Yes, in 1828, this is when Andrew Jackson was running up against John Quincy Adams. And that was a lot of mudslinging as well. They hurled insults on Jackson's wife, Rachel, calling her an adulteress and a dirty black wench, saying that she was prone to lewdness. She had married Jackson before her divorce was final from her previous husband, so that's what spurred all that vitriol. But they also threw it right back at John Quincy Adams, saying that he was accused of selling an American girl to a Russian czar to be a concubine. So there was mud kind of going in both directions. But the Jackson, his wife Rachel, now she died before his inauguration, and he always claimed that all that mudslinging really killed his dear Rachel. And he went on to say, I'll quote Andrew Jackson here, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers, as I know she forgives them. I never can."
Another concept that we're so used to today is campaigning and electioneering and basically various candidates going onto the stump. And outright electioneering was not really a part of the political culture during the 1800s. It was considered too self-promoting back in the day. Stumping by a candidate was not acceptable practice until the campaigns of early 1900s, like 1908 and 1912, where it became much more accepted.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in a recent primary race, I remember one of the candidates kind of bragging that he had been to all the counties in the state of Iowa, stumping. But then I remember reading a quote about some of the early days of our democracy, and it said that they always felt at the time that the office would seek the man rather than the man seeking the office.
Yes, and that was more the culture of that Republican culture of the time, where you wanted to show a lack of self-interest, and that the person who lacked self-interest was a person that you could trust. You know how in the election of 1860, I will say long before 1908 came along, during the election between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas actually did take to the stump in a very leisurely train ride that he took from Washington, D.C. to eventually New York City with lots of side routes. And he did this under the guise of going to visit his mother. But Lincoln and his supporters noted that Douglas took over a month to take this trip. And they even sent out a lost child handbill that said something like, Douglas has left Washington sometime in July to go see his mother, but she's very anxious to see him. He has not arrived. He's been seen in Philadelphia, New York, Hartford, Connecticut, and even at a clam bake in Rhode Island.
Oh, gosh.
He answers to the name Little Giant, and he talks a great deal, very loud and always about himself. So there's that sort of self-promoting thing that you do not want to have associated with yourself. Now, Little Giant was a snipe at Douglas's height. That was another insult because he was only 5'4". He was also somewhat described somewhat by his enemies, about 5 feet nothing in height and about the same in diameter.
Oh,
yes.
gosh.
Douglas fired back at Lincoln, saying that he was horrid looking, sooty, scoundrelly, a cross between a nutmeg dealer, a horse swapper, and a nightman.
Oh, my.
Now, a horse swapper is like a shady horse trader. A nutmeg dealer is probably a reference to an untrustworthy peddler.
Okay.
But the nightman, the nightman was a term for a person who emptied privies at night.
Oh,
yes.
What a low blow. Well, how about we fast forward to 1884?
Okay.
And this is Grover Cleveland versus James Blaine. Forget about wiping the server. This one was all about burning the letter.
Okay.
I'll explain. Grover Cleveland was quite a ladies' man. He had this reputation. And while he was still a bachelor, he actually did father a child.
Out of wedlock.
Out of wedlock. It was quite a scandal. By today's standard, he always provided financial support for the child. By today's standard, it wouldn't be much of a scandal, but it was back then. So the people who were against Cleveland would say, they would chant, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" and take a swipe at his illegitimate child. But then Blaine was not without his problems either. He was accused of shady business dealings with the railroad, and he pretty much confirmed that fact when he wrote a letter to a friend kind of admitting it, and he signed off that letter by saying, "Give my regards to Mrs. Fisher and burn this letter." So of course Cleveland supporters would chant, "Burn this letter, burn this letter."
Well, I guess a little loose behavior is a less problematic for a politician than corruption. And this goes back to that concept of trying to show that you don't have that self-interest, that you are the
Yes.
disinterested politician that people can trust because you have their best interest
Their
at heart.
interest at
Yeah,
heart.
not your own.
Exactly. Well, then let's talk about Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley. That was kind of an interesting campaign because you just can't lose. This is
What
when
do you mean by that?
Okay. This was the incumbent president, Grant,
Okay.
who was running against Horace Greeley, but there was a lot of contention about that. And Grant had a kind of a split within the Republican Party that resulted in a third party. So this third party put up Horace Greeley to oppose Grant. And this action caused the Democratic Party to cancel their convention altogether, and they supported Greeley.
Oh.
But in November 1872, the popular vote was counted, and of course, we have to go to the Electoral College.
Yes.
So they hadn't quite tallied things yet, and in that gap, Horace Greeley died.
Oh my gosh.
And this was one of the only elections we've had where one of the candidates passed away. However, he still got some votes posthumously.
Okay. So Greeley was basically the only presidential candidate to die before the election was finalized.
Yes.
Well, speaking of onlys, I will say that, you know, George Washington was the only president to be unanimously elected, and he did it twice.
That's incredible.
He was also the only president who didn't represent a political party, which I think perhaps politicians of the future might want to consider.
Maybe we should be listening.
Interestingly, in the first presidential election in the fall of 1788, the electoral votes weren't actually counted until the Senate finally achieved a quorum in April of 1789. So months passed.
And we think we
Months.
have to wait a long time to get the results. right?
Yes. They had to be, at that time, tallied by the senators. And Congress was supposed to start meeting in March, which still would have been a large gap in time, but the weather was horrible at that winter, and people had a terrible time getting to New York. And so it was April 7th before the senators reached quorum and were able to count the votes and declare Washington the winner.
Oh my, oh my. So Thomas Jefferson is the first president to have his inauguration in Washington, D.C.
That's right. Now, Washington was inaugurated in New York, and then that was our first seat of government. And then he moved to Philadelphia. His second inauguration was in Philadelphia. John Adams, our second president, also served out his one term in Philadelphia. So Jefferson was the first one of our presidents, the third president, and he was the one that was inaugurated at the new capital city in Washington, D.C. You know, in his speech, when he took over the presidency, and it was after that horrible week of not being able to figure out whether it was going to be Jefferson or Burr, he tried to smooth things over afterwards in his inaugural remarks, and he said, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We've called by different names brethren of the same principles. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. But, you know, as much as he tried to smooth things over, it was a tough time, and it had been a rough election. Jefferson's sentiments notwithstanding, his predecessor, John Adams, did not attend the ceremony, and he was the first president not to do so.
Oh, what a snub.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about some memorable campaigns, but let's talk about some memorable presidents now.
Okay.
So just some interesting trivia. We'll talk about Harry S. Truman.
Okay.
The S stands for nothing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no name. So when you see Harry S. Truman, there's not a period after the S because it's not short for anything.
Okay.
Isn't that interesting?
It is, it is.
And then I think one of a real popular story is about the teddy bear.
Yeah.
And the teddy bear was named after Teddy Roosevelt. You know, he was such a good outdoorsman and hunter, but he was on a hunting trip one time and just refused to shoot a little bear cub.
Oh, I didn't know this.
So the bear cub became kind of the teddy bear
Yes.
doll that we probably all had
Yes.
growing up.
But I didn't know that he had refused to shoot a bear.
Yes.
A bear cub.
A bear cub, because teddy
Oh.
bears are kind of cuddly.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
And also, we have a lot of, first-time presidents, the firsts, and the first president to be born outside the original 13 states was Lincoln. Comes from
that's
your,
right. He comes from my home state
Your
of
home
Illinois.
state.
That's right.
Exactly.
He was not born in. He was born in one of the territories. That's
yeah,
right.
exactly. And let's talk about Jimmy Carter a little bit. He
Okay.
was one of the first. He was the first president to be born in a hospital.
Yes, and he was also the first president to claim to have seen a UFO.
Oh, I wonder if there's a connection there.
I don't think so.
Okay. Another thing about Lincoln, he was the very first president to ever be photographed, and at his inauguration. And ironically, in the photo, standing near Lincoln, is John Wilkes Booth.
Oh, That's kind of spooky.
Isn't that a little bit eerie?
Well, isn't John Garfield the first president to ever speak on the phone?
Yes.
And didn't he actually speak to Alexander Graham Bell?
Yes, and he said, please speak more slowly.
We could all do that.
How about Andrew Johnson? He was the first president to be impeached.
Yeah. And then 131 years later,
Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good run if you have a gap of 131 years in there without
Especially because there were a lot of contested elections and a lot of unsavory moments in politics, but people seem to get above that most of the time.
Yes, I think so. I think in the main we do pretty well, but if you think these contentious elections are anything modern, no.
No, I think it's a big prize to be the president of the United States.
Yes.
And it just is never taken lightly.
Yes, and I think sometimes, we see contenders just grasping for it.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, and people are looking for someone they can trust. And so I think all elections, even, the mudslinging aside, you should think about that and think about trustworthiness as being one of the things that people want the most.
Right, and I know we're kind of reminding our viewers to vote.
Absolutely.
Always vote.
Definitely vote.
At least get your voice heard and your opinions. And we'd like to thank our viewers for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed these presidential elections as much as we enjoyed bringing them to you. Don't forget to set your DVRs. Don't miss an episode of On the Go with AAUW.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.